Okay, recording mode is on. So I welcome Dr. Arka Chattopadhyay, Assistant Professor, IIT Gandhinagar, Gujarat, for this special lecture entitled Introducing Modernism. So Arkoda, over to you.
Thank you so much, Devaditya, for this continued hospitality, shall we say, in the digital mode. It's always nice to come back to a place, albeit digitally, and I can faintly remember some of the names of students who were there in some of the previous lectures I did at Manikchak College. So it's nice to sort of see some of those profile pictures because we don't see faces these days. Anyway, before we start today's lecture, I just want to take a minute to briefly remember uh, one of our professors who unfortunately passed away last week, Shapunda, as we used to call him very fondly, Shapun Chakraborty. He was one of our professors in Jadavpur University. And even though he worked in a completely different area, Renaissance, uh, and we didn't have too many interactions, there was a lot of admiration that not just me, a whole uh, fraternity of students had for him. And again, there are certain teachers, let me just be brief because we have to get on to the lecture, but there are certain teachers who just teach what they're teaching, the content. There are others who teach how to teach. And Shapunda was one of those excellent teachers with his eloquence, with his wit, with his eidetic memory. He basically taught anyone, he taught how to teach, not just whatever he taught. So I just wanted to mention Shapunda in the beginning of this lecture. And if I could, uh, I would like to dedicate this talk to him and to his memory.
That would be a wonderful dedication indeed, Arkoda. I have had my share of very brief interaction with Shapon sir, and I must say those who did not have the fortune of interacting with him, they just really don't know what they missed.
Yeah. And it's just too soon, too soon. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Anyway, with that, we shall begin talking about the topic, introducing modernism. Okay, so let's begin from the very basics, right? When we say modern and when we say modernist or modernism, when we add that suffix ism to modern, something changes, right? Something quite drastically changes. Because what do we call modern usually? At least in popular parlance, modern is something that is not traditional. We have created a sort of a cultural binary. Generally, when we think of the modern, we think of the modern as a departure from something that is traditional. Right? If we think of modernity as a process or modernity as a condition, again, we have to think of it in much, much broader terms than literature or art for that matter, right? Because modernity is a social, political, economic process, right? And this term, modernism, is of course used in art and literature, but it's also used in architecture, for example, modernist architecture. It's used in a variety of fields. Let's also keep that in mind. Now, modernism does not mean an ideological framework to support modernity. Right? Let's again get that clear. So, modernist literature, whatever we call modernist literature, I'll come to that in a minute. But what we call modernist literature is not a simple reflection of modernity as a social, cultural, political, economic process. Usually, when we say modernity, and this term has a very strong European Western lineage. So, in that tradition, when we use the term modernity, it could refer to multiple things actually. One particular way of understanding modernity is to think of a culture of rationality. Okay, a culture of rationality, or where we are all driven by uh, the logical faculties much more than the emotional faculties. Again, I mean, there are, of course, problems in these limited understandings of uh, modernist culture, but nevertheless, I'm just trying to begin by, you know, pointing to certain directions, the way this term is understood usually. So one could think of modernist culture in terms of a culture of rationality. That's one way of thinking about it. The other, which is a more political definition, one could think of the separation between the religious body and the political body, the state and the religion, pulling themselves apart from each other. That is often understood as a certain secular inception of modernity, right? Where the church and the state, to use that sort of Western terminology again, the church and the state are not the same anymore. The church does not dictate terms as a state mechanism, right? That separation of religious and political power is another definition. And the third one, which I'm sure everybody knows here anyway, is this movement from a broadly agrarian economy to, again, a broadly industrial economy, which is why, as you know, as students of literature, the Renaissance period is often called the early modern period. And the English industrialization movement is again considered quite crucial when we think of modernity as a process in the Anglophone context. So, I mean, so much for modernity. But as I said, modernism in literature is definitely, let's say, a fallout of modernity. And I'm deliberately using a word which may have a negative connotation, a fallout of modernity. But it's not exactly an ideological justification for modernity as a process, right? And I say that in a sort of mode of contradistinction. For those of you who might be aware of this famous point that someone like Frederick Jameson makes, that postmodernism is the cultural logic of late capitalism. But modernism, the way I'm going to talk about it, is not necessarily the cultural logic of early capitalism. Of course, we have to see capitalism and modernity together in a certain sense. When we are thinking of modernity as a social process, as a political process, as an economic condition, there are connections between capitalism and modernity, right? Just as in a country like India, whenever we think of modernity, and this is a very common hyphenation in critical language, we almost inevitably call it colonial modernity. Because it's a fact that certain notions of modernity traveled from Europe, or more specifically, traveled from England, because we were colonized by the British. So there's no denying these connections. But at the same time, what I'm trying to say is when we are thinking of modernism as a literary timeline, a period, a style, a collection of movements, we'll see what is what. But anyway, I'm just beginning. When we think of modernism in literature, it's not an unapologetic or an apologetic, I should say, justification of all that happens in modernism or modernity, sorry, as a process. So modernism in literature could also be a critique of the process of modernity. Let's just begin with that formulation. That modernism does not uncritically accept modernity, but engages with modernity, engages with the condition of modernity, and can produce a critique of modernity. As I said, to sort of change Jameson a little bit, modernism is not the cultural logic of early capitalism, if postmodernism is the cultural logic of late capitalism, as he would famously say. With that proviso, let's first talk about this particular conundrum. What is modernism? Is it a set of movements like surrealism, Dadaism, Vorticism, futurism, and all of that happened in Europe in a particular historical timeline? I suppose that's the literary historian's take on modernism, and we can't completely debunk it, of course. Usually, when we think of the history of modernism in literature, we have been almost trained to think only about Europe or only about England or France. France particularly has a very important role to play there. But one of the things that has happened over a large period of time when we now do work on modernist literature, what is called the field of modernist studies, two invariable things have happened. One is there is a general critical consensus that modernism is not so restricted to a historical timeline. It's more of a style. This is an argument that, many critics of modernism, such as Jean-Michel Rabate, Derek Attridge, they have argued that modernism is a matter of style. It's a particular style of writing, not entirely limited to a historical timeline. Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind. That's one consensus. Right? The second consensus is around this term that has developed, of course, in modernist studies, where we now talk about global modernisms, right? Not just one modernism, not only in England or France or Germany or Italy, but modernisms across the world. And there's an understanding that some of these developments are coeval as in they are happening at the same time. Some of these developments have a ripple effect, like a lot of practices of modernism were developed in India, for example, much later in the 50s. Things that were happening in the 20s, let's say, sometimes came to India in the 50s. Again, because of a certain logic of cultural transmission, deferment, and all of that, right? So there are cases where it's not derivative, but it's an after effect. There are other cases where it's completely coeval. Or again, I mean, I don't want to go into this sort of discussion of, who invented this movement first, India or some other country, because this might get into a sort of very hyper-nationalist trajectory that we go into these days. Whenever we talk about knowledge system, the discussion seems to be around who invented it first. But anyway, that's not the point. But there are also other examples, such as, for example, just to give you a concrete example, we have a movement like the Hungryalism, right, in Indian literature, in Bengali literature specifically, but it's a very interesting movement because it didn't happen inside Bengal. For those of you who know, Malay Rai Chaudhuri, Shomi Rai Chaudhuri, these people were outside Bengal at that point. It was primarily from Patna that this movement took off. There is a common misunderstanding that this is a derivative discourse in relation to something like the Beat Generation movement in America. No, it wasn't, right? It happened almost exactly at the same time. The Hungryalism Manifesto was written. The Beat Generation writers came together and formed a movement. And this is part of the Anglo-American late modernist history, right? So there are examples of coeval developments. There are examples of derivative developments, or after effects at least. Like, for example, if you think of the group Krittibash in Bangla literature, I know there's a large contingent of Bengali audience here, so I can say that with a certain degree of understanding that there would be some cultural familiarity. The group Krittibash, and if you think of the kind of writing that Sunil Gangopadhyay, Shakti Chattopadhyay, and Sandipan Chattopadhyay, I'm specifically thinking of these three, the kind of writing they produced, there is a very distinct late modernist slant there. And they would specifically talk about terms like adhunikata or modernity. Not so much adhunikata bad or modernism, but there was definitely this term in their discourse. Okay? In fact, Sandipan Chattopadhyay wrote this very small but very telling little thing. It's an essay or a note, in fact, more than an essay, Shahitya Bishayak Prastab, or proposition concerning literature, proposal concerning literature, something like that. I'm just doing right away, just translating it right away. And he made some very interesting observations there, which go into this idea of global modernism or transnational modernism. So he would, for example, talk about someone like Kamal Kumar Majumdar, who knew French very well, as we know, had, in fact, connections with writers in France. In fact, I don't know whether you know this, some of the writers in that particular group called the French Nouveau Roman, or the New Novel of the 50s and 60s, there's a very important female writer there, Nathaniel Sarraute. And Kamal Majumdar had a connection with Nathaniel Sarraute. So anyway, there were these global or transnational networks of modernism, and this is again a major discussion point in current modernist studies, how modernism developed as a network across the world. If you're interested, you could read Sophie Sieta's book on modernist networks. Anyway, so Shandipan goes on in that essay to talk about writers like Kamal Kumar, who are almost writing in a French Bengali. And then he goes into these examples such as Eliot. Was he American or British? Same with Pound, for example. So he creates this sort of idea of transnational modernism. Modernism as a movement that jumps from one tradition to another, goes across the borders, as it were. Again, the kind of experiment Shandipan himself did, for example, with the collage form, would remind you of surrealist montage, surrealist collage, modernism, and so on. To give another concrete example from the same group, Kritibas, Sunil Gangopadhyay, who is, of course, who started off primarily as a poet, as you know, but he was writing novels quite early on as well. One of his early novels, which is not discussed to that extent, is a novella, in fact, called Maya Kanoner Phul. And I mention this because here, in this particular novel, what he does is something very reminiscent of an entire late modernist literary movement in France. I might come back to this, but I would just like to take this moment to sort of connect it here. Oulipo. Oulipo was the name of a group of writers in the 60s in France, and they practiced this thing called restrained writing or constrained writing. The most famous example of this is a novel by George Perec, La Disparition or Avoid. The English title works better, Avoid, because it does not have the vowel E. So the vowel E is avoided. And it's extremely difficult to write an entire novel. And this is not a novella. Avoid is a more than 200-page novel, a decent length, So in Avoid, Perec does not use that particular vowel throughout the novel. And that's a restraint. So these writers used to do what is called restrained writing. This idea is picked up by Sunil Gangopadhyay in Maya Kanoner Phul, and throughout the novel, in fact, he says this in the dedicatory note. He says this in the dedicatory note, about not using, especially certain kinds of words. It's much more flexible in this novel. It's not very rigorous, but at the same time, he appeals to the rhetorics of Bengali language and the fact that certain words may or may not be required. Such as, if you think about it, the way we speak the language in Bangla, sometimes we don't need the word ami, for example, the subject noun. The subject noun can often be dropped and the sentence will still make sense. Of course, this is done in a more informal way in English as well, but in a fairly formal way, we can still drop the subject noun from a Bangla sentence. Anyway, I would request someone, if your audio is on, to please switch it off, because I can hear a mild hum, which is slightly distracting.
Yes, Orkoda, I am trying to have a look.
No problem. And I'll continue in the meantime, but it'll be great if that could be switched off. Yeah, great.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So to continue now. So I think this, let me just bring it back to the very beginnings of modernism now. You've got an idea about global modernism, I hope. And of course, my examples, because of the reason of my own background and the background of many listeners here, are from Bengali literature. But these examples could be given from other vernacular literatures as well, and even Indian English literature. If you consider someone like Salman Rushdie and the lineage that he has, or someone like Anita Desai, again, the kind of lineage she has, there's a very strong modernist style that inflects both their writings. And of course, Desai has talked about how influential Virginia Woolf has been for her. Salman Rushdie, for example, is again someone who takes after that, a very sort of Rabelian, modernist tradition of humor, a caustic, ironic kind of humor, right? So anyway, I mean, there are ways of arguing about this when we talk about global modernisms, that there are many sort of ideas that, of course, moved across borders, and there was a very complex network of ideas that was often produced globally. And so we have to think of modernism in a transnational and global register. That's the other thing that has happened in modernist studies, apart from this more or less critical consensus that someone writing in the 90s, someone writing right now, for example, could also be considered modernist. Right?
Orpoda, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No,
I
no,
think the issue for some reason is persisting, and I can't find anybody else's microphone switched on
right. It
except for
might be a,
you.
it
So
might be,
I am muting all. I'm using the
sure,
option muting all for a moment, and
sure,
I'll then unmute.
sure. I think we can continue because it seems like
Yes,
it's still
it,
going on.
it's still
After,
going on.
yeah, yeah, after you muted,
Really am at a loss to understand
yeah,
what.
no, no, it's fine. It's fine. It might be some technical glitch, whatever
Yeah,
it is.
yeah.
But yeah, let's continue. It's not very high, so it's all right. I mean, I can continue. Thankfully, I'm not using earphones. That would have been more difficult. Okay. So anyway, coming back to what we were discussing. So when we, let's go back to the beginnings of modernism and just give you some context a little bit. So the way modernism is usually thought of in that historical timeline is a kind of movement where we think of high modernism, and then we think of late modernism, and then it kind of converges into something like postmodernism. Uh, High modernism, we are talking about the first 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century, and especially in Europe, in England, in France, and works such as James Joyce's Ulysses and Eliot's Wasteland, both of which came out in the same year, which is why it's considered a very important year for modernism, 1922. But before that, there is the publication of Eliot's Sacred Wood, that has, among other essays, the famous essay Tradition and Individual Talent. And there are 2 or 3 ideas from this Eliot essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, that become really important for modernism. One is, I'll just enumerate them. I know we don't have the time to go into a lot of things, but trying to give you some introductory context here. Throughout the lecture, that would be my primary goal. So, one is this idea of impersonality. Eliot talks about the impersonality of art, right? And says that at some level, poetry is not an expression of personality, it's an escape from personality. Similarly, he makes this famous comment that poetry is an escape from emotion. So there's a sort of a deliberate attempt to reverse romantic ideology, the romantic idea of poetry as a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, to quote Wordsworth. So there's an attempt to go against that, to go against emotions in poetry, somewhat tendentiously, because it's not always possible, and Eliot's own poetry can be very moving at times. But nevertheless, there's an attempt strategically to go against that idea of emotion and to go against that idea of personality, lyricism or personality. The third thing that this essay does is to talk about that dialectic. As I said, it's not a binary. I would say it's more of a dialectic than a binary, right? Because in a binary, there are just 2 terms. In a dialectic, there are 3 terms: thesis, antithesis, and then some sort of a sublation that produces synthesis. Anyway, why do I say it's a dialectic, and what is it a dialectic about? It's a dialectic about the tradition, which is again that, term that is often contrasted with the modern, and individual talent. So modernist literature pays a great deal of attention to experiment, innovation, experiment, what is called avant-gardism. It's a military term, somewhat unfortunately used here, but it refers to a kind of literature that always wants to reinvent itself, always wants to innovate with new forms, with new content. Someone like Ezra Pound would always say this as a slogan: make it new, make it new. Right? So there is this, of course, there's a very strong avant-gardism or innovation or experimentalism, which is kind of part of modernism. In fact, one could say modernism is an imagination of literature as experiment. That could be considered a particular definition of modernism, one definition among many, that it's about conceptualizing literature as a kind of experiment. Right? And we already have an example from late modernism there, how to write an entire novel without the vowel E. Right? Anyway, to come back, 1922, by the way, is also the same year. So the three ideas from tradition and individual talent. The third idea, I should mention that before I move on, is historical sense. That's the term Eliot uses. So he says that every writer, even though every writer might be an individual talent, might want to subvert tradition, but every writer is also located in a tradition. So whether I like it or not, I'm writing in the same language that such and such people wrote. Right? Again, it doesn't matter whether I consciously follow a writer. Like, for example, anyone writing in Bangla, doesn't matter whether they're great admirers of Rabindranath, there is a certain element of Rabindranath in the very language that we write, or Bankim Chandra or others, right? Because that's how language is created. A literary language is created by certain writers. And of course, over the years, other writers might come in to displace them and become more of a, inventor of that literary language. But we do consciously or unconsciously follow the history of a language, the language in which we write. Okay. So keeping that in mind, again, historical sense, tradition and individual talent as a kind of a dialectical tension, tradition and individual talent in that tension, and this idea of impersonality and escape from emotion. These are the important Eliot-esque ideas from that essay. He also wrote this famous essay on Joyce's Ulysses, where he used this term mythical method, which became a very important term in modernism, mythical method. And of course, he was talking about how Joyce was using the Homeric epic, okay, Odysseus and his journey, and that frame was used by Joyce to talk about one particular day in the city of Dublin in Ireland, right? That's Ulysses. So this is we're still in high modernism. By the way, the same year, 1922, if we globalize the context, we see a work such as Lipika is published by Rabindranath Tagore. And Lipika is a very interesting text. Of course, Tagore or Rabindranath Tagore, however you want to call him, is not a classic modernist. He has a very strong critique of modernism as well. As some of you might know, in that famous essay on modern literature, he talks about Baudelaire as a furniture poet, as a poet of furniture. Anyway, so he had a critique of modernism, but it's interesting that towards his late life, he was kind of going in a very peculiarly modernist direction, especially if we think of the paintings, if we think of the use of nonsense verse in his final writings, if you think of a collection like Golpo Shalpo, not Golpo Guccio, but Golpo Shalpo, the collection that came again very late, or even a children's literary text such as Shame. These are all very experimental and in a certain way modernist. Anyway, I think Lipika is a very important text. The term Lipika refers to text, right? And if you have read Lipika, you know this, right? That we don't know whether these are poems or prose works. Are they short stories? What are they? That's the first question that comes to mind when we read them. So this idea of a text that defies genre, defies generic classifications, is also a very modernist idea that Lipika produces, as it were, in the mind of the readers, right? So again, I would like to mention Lipika in the same breath, in the same year, published in the same year, 1922, as the other two important masterpieces. Now, if we go on, of course, we have to mention Virginia Woolf here. Virginia Woolf is perhaps the only first generation female writer in that high modernist group of writers. And again, I mean, there's a whole discussion that I tend to do in my modernism class where I talk about female modernist writers. We don't have the time for that, but I'll definitely give you some names in case you're interested. Because a lot of work in modernist studies over the years has also unearthed the apparent lack of female writers. You know, again, and with someone like Virginia Woolf, as we know, it's because of his connections, her connections with Leonard Woolf, her husband, who was a famous publisher, and also this, you know, whole connection with the very influential Bloomsbury group at that point, that perhaps she could, you know, make it the way she did, because it was very difficult for female writers, even in the beginning of the 20th century, to, you know, operate at a certain level. But before we go into gender politics, let me quickly mention the essays that I wanted to mention, especially two by Virginia Woolf. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Brown is one essay. The other one is an essay on modern fiction. So in Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Brown, I think one thing that comes out very clearly is this idea of modernism as a style. Again, I don't have the time to go into details, but she imagines a scenario where she goes into a train, there she sees a man and a woman, she imagines their backstories, what could they be like from what they're wearing. There's a whole series of social judgments there. And after all this, she says, but my style is failing me. I don't want to write like this. This is a style of social realism. Right? So, and then we have that famous statement in Virginia Woolf that something changed in the human mind in the sort of first few decades of the 20th century. So, broadly speaking, we have this movement from social realism to what is famously called stream of consciousness. Right? Stream of consciousness is the term that comes from William James, who happens to be the brother of Henry James, the famous American modernist novel writer. Henry James's brother, William James, in the book Principles of Psychology, came up with this expression, stream of consciousness. He's a psychologist, and he was interested in completely different things, not in literature or novel writing or things like that. But this term was appropriated by literature. Again, it's slightly wrong to say that it's a literary term. It's not. It's a term invented by a psychologist to make this very important point that consciousness is not really a train. That's the other image he debunks. If you go into that text by William James, you would see James says that consciousness is not a chain or a train. It's a stream, right? But again, let us not be mistaken to think that if consciousness is a stream, it means it's completely uninterrupted. No, it's not. In fact, the image that William James uses is, you know, think of a riverbed and think of all these buckets, you know, on the riverbed. If you fill them in, the more you fill them in, if there is a spillover, the water will ultimately, you know, fill up the void or the gap between the buckets. If you keep pouring in, and this happens everywhere, right? If you have 3 glasses and if you keep pouring in, at some point, if the 3 glasses are in a larger container, that container will also fill up, right? So that's the idea James is talking about, consciousness as a stream, as a river. But that does not mean there are no gaps. There could be interruptions in consciousness. And James is very much sort of aware of that. But what he's saying is consciousness has a way of filling out those gaps, filling up those gaps. Right? So anyway, this term was appropriated by modernist literary writers, especially into this terminology, interior monologue. Interior monologue became a very important technique in modernist novel writing, especially. If you think about Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, or a much later novel, which is perhaps the most dense example of this, Waves. Waves is the novel I'm thinking of, and Woolf famously said I'm not writing to a plot. I'm writing to the rhythm of the waves that I can hear. It's a wonderful novel. Anyway, of course, there's To the Lighthouse, and again a kind of a very famous temporal disconnect in the middle of the novel, where we have that famous section called "Time Passes," and there's a huge interruption. Anyway, to come back to Virginia Woolf's theorization of modern fiction, there's a memorable passage in the essay on modern fiction, which I would like to at least mention here, where she says that we have to write reality as it is. We don't need to order it. We don't need to create an artificial order on reality. And then she gives this beautiful image, which partially comes from Greek philosophy and her interest in philosophy generally, that there are atoms falling in the mind. And we have to capture the exact order in which these atoms fall without trying to reorder them, without trying to restructure them. This is the modernist idea of style, let's say, trying to write reality as it is, which requires a redefinition of realism. This is not social realism, a term that has often been used that is psychological realism. So in modernism, psychological realism replaces social realism, as it were. And then you have, of course, a writer like D.H. Lawrence. His novels, again, go very much in between poetry and prose. He was a poet, of course, but I'm talking about the lyrical style of a novel like Rainbow or Kangaroo and so on. To look at the intellectual backdrop of modernism, we have to think of at least two things which play a vital role. One is Marxism, broadly speaking, the political register, and the other is psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis. So Marx and Freud, in that sense, are two very important intellectual pillars for modernism. Let's keep that in mind. And they have a whole set of ripple effects when it comes to modernist literature. Of course, there's been a large debate in literary criticism about the politics of modernist literature. As some of you would know, I'm sure, someone like Lukács, right? George Lukács, the Hungarian Marxist literary critic, has been very critical. Lukács is generally very critical of modernism because Lukács thinks modernism is almost naturalism. There is no principle of selection in modernism. We cannot write political novels if we write in that style. We cannot write historical novels if we write in the modernist style. It's not politically engaged enough, historically conscious enough. And it goes into this sort of bourgeois despair of the psyche. Okay, that's the kind of slightly, reductive reading that that someone like Lukács does, where he basically argues modernism is naturalism. And interestingly, he uses the example of photography to say that, okay, just as a photographic image does not have any ideology, it just shows the image as it is, modernist literature does not have any ideological principle. It just shows reality as it is, and that does not help anyway if we are thinking about, furthering the means of social change. But anyway, as we know, photography is not ideologically neutral, right? So there's a problem in that analogy as well. Anyway, so that's Lukács, one way of responding to the politics of modernism. But then later on, we have critics like Raymond Williams, much later, through the sort of turn to the French structural Marxist Althusser, we have, other Marxist literary critics who have a different approach to modernism. Again, I don't have the time to go on into this and go further into this, but we do see a change from Lukács's early reaction to modernism to, let's say, Raymond Williams, assessing modernism more, sensibly, I suppose, where he talks about both the left-wing and the right-wing tendencies. Futurism, Wyndham Lewis, and that entire tradition had a very strong right-wing political philosophy. Pound himself was a famous supporter or infamous supporter of Mussolini. So there is a right-wing tendency in modernism, even Eliot in certain ways. But there's also a very strong left-wing tendency if we think of Dadaism, Surrealism, Breton, or figures such as a little bit later, perhaps, if we think of figures like W.H. Auden and that entire generation of poets, often called the Auden generation, they had a very strong left leaning. Anyway, so there is a sort of a balance there, as it were. Uh, uh, Terry Eagleton and more contemporary Marxist literary critics again have argued in favor of modernism much more than Lukács would have. To very briefly address the question of psychoanalysis, surrealism itself is an interesting example because these are writers, be it not all writers, by the way. Another thing to remember is these are all hybrid movements. They are not just movements in literature. They're movements in painting. They're movements in cinema. Like one of the first surrealist works is, after all, a film that Salvador Dali made with Luis Buñuel, the Andalusian dog, Ashian Andalu, which is available on YouTube. It's a short film if you're interested. So the movement of surrealism entirely takes after the dream work that Freud brings in. And the interest in, this is a separate topic of discussion, but anyway, I just want to flag it, that modernist literature is often very interested in ideas in the scientific tradition. We have a very strong interest in someone like Émile Zola when it comes to the experimental biologist Claude Bernard. He writes this long essay on the experimental novel, where the idea of experiment entirely comes from Claude Bernard, the experimental biologist. We have a very strong interest in mathematics in Oulipo, as I briefly mentioned. That idea of restrained writing comes from mathematics. And some of these writers are also trained mathematicians, such as Jacques Roubaud. So it's a very interesting kind of an intersection between science and literature that we see in modernism. Be it biology, be it physics, be it mathematics. It's very interestingly present in the history of modernisms. Anyway, to continue a little bit further, just with the ideas of modernism, this idea of interior monologue, how does one practice it in the novel? So if you think about the latter half of Mrs. Dalloway, a novel that you might have read or you will read perhaps, we have very local examples of this interior monologue. So interior monologue can refer to the, let's say, unrestrained thought of a person who's not necessarily talking about it, but these are unspoken thoughts, right? These are unspoken thoughts, unfiltered and unedited, right? Another famous example comes at the end of Ulysses, and we have Molly Bloom, right? We have an unpunctuated monologue of Molly Bloom that runs for more than 30 pages without punctuation, right? In Joyce's later work, such as Finnegan's Wake, we have a sort of radicalization of this modernist idea of rigor, formal experiment, and so on. He uses dream language. He uses 29 languages at least in that novel. It's one of the most daunting novels to read ever. Right? Wants to recreate the epic once again, as he did, but in a much more obscure form in Finnegan's Wake. But this brings me to this idea. Modernism traditionally believes in that high culture, low culture divide. Postmodernism is usually thought to not believe in that divide. So modernism believes in shocking the reader by giving them something which is not very easy to understand. That's a very common ideological principle that runs through modernism, which is why sometimes, of course, Marxists may not like it, because there's too much of experiment going against historical consciousness, as it were. But there is, of course, some merit to what Lukács is saying there. Anyway, to come back to what I was saying, if we continue with this, in late modernism, we have writers like Beckett, for example, who becomes famous only in the 50s, but we have to think of his writing career beginning in the 30s, very much, following the modernist tradition. So we have writers, such as Borges and Beckett and many others, of course. One book that I would suggest to go back and look at modernism from postmodernism is this famous book by Brian McCall called The Postmodernist Fiction, Postmodern Fictions, I think. So McCall makes this very famous point. Let me just skim the surface of his argument here, that modernist novels are epistemological novels. He makes this distinction, right? A philosophical distinction. But postmodernist novels are ontological novels. What does that mean? It means that modernist novel is more interested in the problem of knowledge than in the problem of being. And by being, we're talking about the being of fiction. But postmodernist novels are more interested in perceiving how they themselves are constructed. So the important question in a postmodernist novel, and the example that he gives, Brian McCall gives, is Crying of Lot 49. Anyway, I'm not going to go into examples because that will take us into a different direction. But anyway, the point that McCall is making is that postmodernist fiction is predominantly ontological, in the sense that it is interested in its own narrative universe and how that universe is constructed. Someone like Pynchon does that in Crying of Lot 49, according to McCall. Whereas modernist fiction is more interested in the question of knowledge. How can we know the world? So the postmodernist question is there a world? How many worlds are there? Are there worlds within worlds, within worlds, within worlds, like Chinese boxes? That's the postmodernist fiction's question. The modernist fiction's question is, how do I know the world? Can we fully know the world? What are the unknowns, the great unknowns of the world? So that's the distinction he makes, among others. He also says that modernism or modernist literature is more about time, whereas postmodernism is more about space. Of course, these are not absolute terms. We have to think of them as a shift of emphasis. It's not an absolute transition, but a shift of emphasis from time to space, from epistemology to ontology. But time is indeed important, also because in social political terms, modernity as a process gives birth to clock time, factory time, labor time, right? That's the famous argument about surplus value. Surplus value, Marx's famous term, surplus value, is also a term that refers to time and the whole culture of overtime, where you work for more hours than you should, but you are paid less money. You're not paid for that overtime, right? And that's something that Marx tries to show, among other things, of course, through the theory of surplus value. The Marxist idea of alienation played a very important role, I think, in modernism, because what is often considered psychological alienation is not just psychological alienation. It's always a social, political alienation that produces psychological alienation. Depression, what we call depression these days, more than the term alienation is used, depression is not just a personal thing. Depression often comes from various complicated structural, social problems of oppression, discrimination, and many other things. Right? I'm not saying always, but it can. So what is considered psychological alienation is also social political alienation. And Marx's doctrine of alienation does play an important role in modernism. That's how, for example, someone like Raymond Williams would see the idea of alienation in Kafka's novels, which are deeply political, goes without saying. How can you read The Trial or The Castle without thinking about state mechanism, without thinking about bureaucracy, without thinking about capitalism? It's impossible to do that, right? So this understanding of modernism depoliticizing literature is not correct, I think. There could be certain examples of that, but that's not all modernism anyway. To come back to another point I made earlier, at least to give you some pointers, a lot of work in more recent modernist studies has been devoted to unpacking the writing of various marginal modernists, especially female writers, right, who were buried to a certain extent by the politics of canonization, right, which was very patriarchal, goes without saying. And certain writers like Anna Kavan or Gertrude Stein or Juna Barnes, these are writers who have been literally excavated and resuscitated into the modernist canon. They've been put back there, as it were. They were always there. Mina Loy, who wrote the Feminist Manifesto. So Mina Loy, I'm just giving you some names. If you're interested, please go ahead and read some of their works. Strongly recommended is Anna Kavan's novel Ice, or Mina Loy's poetry. She primarily was a poet, though she wrote some short stories as well. Juna Barnes' great novel, The Nightwood, which should be read, I suppose, in any modernism syllabi, but unfortunately it is not. Whatever. So there are female modernists at work. As I said, I just wanted to mention some of them. Of course, other than Virginia Woolf, who is very widely mentioned, goes without saying. To talk about late modernism a little bit, again, I touched upon some of the movements. We don't have the time to go into them in a deeper way, but to talk about the late modernist traditions, one would have to think about something like Oulipo. So I'll very briefly mention two and possibly finish there, and we could have a discussion after that. For example, in Oulipo, as I mentioned, they practiced this kind of constrained writing, but their large agenda was to mathematize literature. Someone like Raymond Queneau, for example, wrote 10 sonnets. It's a wonderful experiment, almost an origamic kind of experiment. He wrote 10 sonnets. So how many lines are there in a sonnet? 14, right? Now, every line, because of the way in which that book was made, could interact with the same line of the next sonnet. You see what I mean? So every line of a sonnet was cut onto a particular strip of paper. If you go online, if you go to YouTube, you'll get an idea about, if you just do Raymond Queneau sonnets, you'll understand this. You'll understand what I'm talking about. Maybe in the discussion I could show you an image. But anyway, the idea is every line of every sonnet interacts with the same line number of all the other sonnets. So what we get is a possibility of producing 10 to the power 14 number of sonnets from that particular book. And later on, this has been called a sonnet machine. Others have, there are contemporary writers. Oulipo, by the way, is still on. It's a group that is still active. Most of the founding members are not there anymore, other than Jacques Roubaud, who's still pretty active. But others have taken it on, as it were, and taken on this idea of experiment. But the point that Oulipo makes is that there are always restraints in literature. We don't see them always. Sonnet itself is a restraint. You can't write the 15th line, or you can't write a poem of 13 lines, right? So this idea of restrained writing is something that they pick up from mathematics. They're very interested in mathematicians like David Hilbert, or who talks about visual geometry, or set theory. Nicholas Bourbaki. This is a group of mathematicians called Nicholas Bourbaki. It's a pseudonym. They came up with this book called The Theory of Sets, which was still at a very early stage in the 60s. But set theory became huge in mathematics, as everybody knows now. So they were using set theory. They were using what is called combinatorics. Combinatorics is not exactly permutation combination, but something like that. To give you a simple example, if there are two things, I can only arrange them in two ways, right? If there are three things, what are the different ways of arranging them? It's 1 into 2 into 3. That's the factorial law. 1 into 2 into 3 is 6. So there are 6 ways of arranging 3 elements. there are two ways of arranging two elements because 1 into 2 is equal to 2, right? So this factorial mathematics produces this field called combinatorics, which has its own connections with geometry and even set theory for that matter. So these writers were interested in combinatorics because combinatorics gave them a whole set of possibilities. And they were interested in innovating with literature. And here I must harp on this point that I have made a little bit here and there, but it's very important in modernism. Modernism believes in a kind of formalism, sometimes at least. Or if not formalism, at least a very important engagement with literary form. It believes that certain formal experiments can communicate a different order of meaning than what the content does. Sometimes it's a hierarchy of form over content. Sometimes it's form becoming content, as Beckett famously said about Joyce, about Finnegan's Wake. He said, this is form as content and content as form. You cannot distinguish between the two anymore, right? So this formalization is what brings modernism to something like mathematics, which is the discourse of formalization, perhaps the discourse par excellence of formalization. Again, to very briefly perhaps end with a new novel, the new novel, which was a sort of a correlate of the new wave French cinema at that point, of Godard and others. I want to mention particularly, I've already mentioned Nathaniel Sorruth. Definitely recommend her great novel, which kind of opened this movement in a way, Tropism. Tropism is the name of her novel. We could also think of writers like Michel Butor, Claude Simon, and others. But the sort of theoretician of this group, a filmmaker, a novelist, of course, is Alan Robert Gray. And I'll end with this, I'm aware of time as well. So Alan Robert Gray wrote this almost like a manifesto, notes on the new novel, where he argues, and this is the break from the early modernist psychological novel, he would say that, okay, we've talked too much about psyche, about depth. What about the surfaces? And this is a famous moment in essays on the new novel, the book that came out in 1965 from Grove Press, where Robert Gray says, we haven't yet explored the pure descriptive value of literature. It's very interesting. He's mobilizing description against realism, which is ironic because description is the tool of realism. And he's talking about description in a very mathematical way, where description will not reflect, will not go into the depth of things, but will simply talk about the surface of objects, the corners, the mathematical contours of an object. How is a cup shaped? What is the shape of a chair? What is the shape of a table? And all of that. Right? And if you read Robert Gray, if you read his great novels like Erasers, Jealousy, The Regicide, these novels are full of these examples of pure description that goes on for pages. And the focus is on the object, which is why new novel is sometimes called objectal literature. Cannot be called objective, by the way. It's not a scientific objectivist discourse, but objectal literature. So the new novel is sometimes called objectal literature because it's a literature that focuses on the object, not the human subject. The human subject is a tiny part of this large tapestry. So, I mean, I of course, this is an introductory talk. I did not make an argument. I was primarily talking about the different strands of modernism, from high modernism to late modernism to postmodernism. But as I said, there are contemporary writers like John Banville, for example, who is as modernist as anybody, almost trying to recover the artistry of the novel form. Not in his more recent works, where he's becoming a little more kitschy and becoming more postmodernist with his detective fiction. But if you go back to early Banville, if you go back to the so-called Frames trilogy of this Irish writer. And if you read novels like Ghosts, part of that trilogy, or The Book of Evidence, uh, The Untouchable, these are novels, and perhaps the most famous one because it won the Booker Prize is The Sea. These are novels where he's attempting to, in a way, recreate the novel as a very strict art form, almost like a painting, almost like a sculpture. And it's unmistakable that these works also deal with art. They often have art as a theme in them. Even a late work by Banville, like The Blue Guitar, has art as a theme in them. Then there are writers like James Coetzee, again, very clearly taking after a modernist tradition. He wrote his PhD on Beckett. Even his more recent work is a kind of return to modernism and the modernist idea of allegory, undefined Kafkaesque allegory. I'm thinking about the Jesus trilogy, the Jesus trilogy. Uh, so the childhood of Jesus, the school days of Jesus, and the death of Jesus, the trilogy that is now complete, I think. Yeah, so there are contemporary writers who could also be seen in that light of modernism. Modernism could be used as a heuristic or an analytical principle. Let me end with this postscript. I wanted to show you this book. It's a very small and a very popular book in that sense, written in a popular style. Peter Boxall, and the title of the book is The Value of the Novel. What he does here is very interesting. As a modernist scholar, he uses modernism as a heuristic tool and certain ideas of modernism as a heuristic tool to discuss the entire history of Anglophone novels. So he's doing a modernist reading of early novels, which are clearly not modernist, at least in that historical sense, or proto novels like Robinson Crusoe or Moby Dick. These are or Dickens, again, Victorian novel, not really considered modernist, right? So this is another approach that a modernist scholar like Boxall takes, where he brings in ideas from modernism, such as the representational break, right? The representational break. This is a very old idea in modernism. Maybe I should have mentioned it earlier, but let me quickly mention it as we end, that language cannot represent reality. Very simply, that's the thesis. Language cannot represent reality. And you could think of the works of Ferdinand de Saussure and this idea of arbitrary language that comes through the work in linguistics. So modernism believes in this skepticism towards language. Language is not a great tool to represent reality. A lot of modernism is an attempt to subvert realism because of this representational problem of language, right? So to keep that in mind, is to so what Boxall does here is to bring back that idea of representational break into proto novels such as Robinson Crusoe, and basically trying to argue whether the so-called realist novels are actually realist or not. That's the question he seems to probe. Is Dickens, after all, a realistic novelist? So it's a very interesting way of using modernism as a heuristic tool to approach the history of the novel. I'll just finish with that. And again, the point was to open up multiple threads. So I'm guessing there might be questions, and I hope there are questions, and I'm happy to take them. Thank you.
Okay, so I was actually immersed in thought because the lecture made references to a lot of things. I'm coming to that when I give my concluding remarks, but I must open now this session for questions. So now the platform is more or less open for the audience. If you feel like asking a question by directly switching on your microphone, please go ahead, minding the background noise, of course. But otherwise, you can mention it. And with Orkoda's permission, since we have predominantly a Bangali audience here, and keeping the students' difficulties in phrasing out their thoughts so readily in a foreign language, I think we can also request the students যে তোমরা বাংলাতেও যদি প্রশ্ন
Sure.
করো, সেটা এই অংশটুকুতে বাংলাতেই তোমরা
No
করতে
problem.
পারো, উত্তরটাও বাংলা ইংলিশ মিশিয়ে দেওয়া যায়।
No problem.
That's a very
Yeah,
generic,
sorry.
and it's a little bit difficult to answer probably in
Yeah.
such a limited span. But I would still request Orkoda to
Right.
address.
So, why was modernism introduced? That's very that's very difficult question. Yes, as Devadita said. Uh, I suppose again, modernism. If we think of, as I said in the very beginning, I think I've already answered this question in a way in the first half
Yes,
of the
yes,
talk,
yes.
because when we say modernism, we talk about literature of a certain period, at least in a very orthodox sense. That's what modernist scholars would like to believe, that modernism refers to the literature of the period of modernism. Adhunik Shomayer Sahitya. Right. Now, the question is uh, perhaps because there were social conditions, it would automatically come into literature, right? I mean, this is how any important social, let's say, idea in circulation comes into literature, right? It's very difficult to say why does it come into literature. It comes into literature because at some level, literature cannot just deal with itself. It's a social institution like anything else. And even if we are talking about the most obscure, the most complex work of literature, it still has some connection with society. May not be a work of social realism, but that does not mean it is completely non-social or asocial, right? And I can see the second question: how did it impact society? That's kind of related, so I'm trying to answer both questions here. How did it impact society? Again, we can't have like an index to measure it out, right? And say that okay, this is how it impacted society. That's very difficult to say. But modernism impacted society, so that's the two-way function. Let me try and answer this in this way. There's one way in which society, of course, impacts literature, right? Social trends get represented in literature. But then there is another, question where what happens is whatever is produced in the literary institution impacts society. That takes much more time, right? Because if we are not being very utopian about it, there's only a very limited social change that literature can make. But I can give you one example from around modernism, and that will, I suppose, finish my response to that question. So, if you think about a novel like Madame Bovary, okay, at that point, the whole medical discussion around hysteria actually started with this novel. And that's a very important question to keep in mind. So, again, I think these are repetitive questions. How did it affect culture? I mean, I think you mean effect, not affect. But anyway, how did it affect culture? The same way as society. Society and culture are not two different things. They're quite often one and the same. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is in Madame Bovary, or Madame Bovary as a novel, sparks this entire discussion about hysteria in the medical fraternity. And to a very large extent, hysteria is considered this feminine malady, which is a very sexist classification, of course. As we know, even in classical Freudian psychoanalysis, hysteria is not gendered. A man can be as hysteric as a woman, if not even more. Right? There are so many examples of hysteric men in public culture these days. I don't need to give you examples, you have enough. Uh, anyway, but that's a concrete example of how literature can have a sort of feedback loop with society or with culture. To give another example, maybe from the Indian context, and again, I'm kind of partially responding to that question about culture as well. I'm just trying to think of the actual name of the novel. Just give me 1 second.
Sure, Orkoda.
Since Google is right here, let me just not give you the wrong title. Yes. M and the Big Whom. This is a novel by Jerry Pinto, who is a famous translator and a great novelist in his own right. Now, Jerry Pinto's novel, M and the Big Whom, was a novel about his mother's illness and the medical conditions she had. Uh, anyway, the cultural impact is this. What happened after that novel was published is actually very interesting because there are very few examples of that in literary circulation. So after Pinto's novel came out, many readers wrote to him, and they wrote letters to him or somewhat detailed stories to him about the mother, about their own experiences with their loved ones and various kinds of deaths that had happened in their family. They identified with the novel because they had a sick mother too, and things like that. And what Pinto does in a book later on, and I can't remember the title of this book, but he edits a book with all the responses that came out. So that's again a concrete example of social cultural effect of literature. Of course, at a micro level, because we don't need to be very ambitious here and think that literature can always change the world. No, it always cannot. But there can be little changes that it can bring in. I hope that addresses the question a little bit. There are many. So, Debarito, would you mind navigating this a little bit? Because there are quite a few questions.
Yes, of course, of course. I was in fact thinking if I should also read out, because that I think would be more helpful, because
Thank you.
now we have some very nuanced questions coming in. This one is from our student Prottoy. He asks whether modernism was influenced by the two world wars and the Great Depression, directly or even at all.
Hmm. That's a very good question. Yes, I mean, it was most definitely. I mean, again, I mean, how do we think of its, how do we think of modernism's connection with war? That's a very, of course, it's a very vast area. One could think of the sort of, and again, I'm not just saying the World War, but generally speaking, for example, a novel like The Great Badge of Courage, Crane's novel, is at some level considered very much part of a sort of proto-modernist or early modernist kind of work. The interwar period, the Great Depression, the Cold War, all these things had a very strong impact on modernism. There's no doubt about that. I think, again, a famous example of World War and modernism would be the character of Septimus Smith, if you remember, in Dalloway, Mrs. Dalloway, by Virginia Woolf. And this is a soldier who has had war trauma, and that's a sort of major subplot in the book until and unless he commits suicide. So, I mean, there is, of course, a very important set of poems written by someone like Auden. I mentioned him earlier in a different context, but Auden writes poetry on war. Wilfred Owen is not a typical modernist poet, but having said that, Wilfred Owen is another important encounter of war with modernism. The other interesting thing is, maybe this is a slightly unexpected response to your question, but I'm also thinking of the sort of fascist direction within modernism. If you think of Marinetti, and if you read the Futurist Manifesto that was written by Marinetti and others, you see that there's a certain propagation of war through literature. There's an understanding of literature as war, which is a very fascist kind of an understanding, right? As opposed to that, in a text like Waiting for Godot, we have a response to war, but it's a much more pacifist response to war. And again, Beckett is an interesting case because he fought in the French Resistance, saw the World War from very close quarters. And if you think of Beckett's early theatre, especially Waiting for Godot and Endgame, they're both haunted by the war, even though they do not directly mention the war. But that's classic Beckett, that's typical, right? But they are clearly responding to the war, which is like a hollowed out content. Again, I go back to a point that I think I made in the Endgame lecture with some of you, that Adorno famously made. that Beckett writes a play about the atom bomb without mentioning the atom bomb. That's Endgame. Okay. So, and that's a deliberate attempt to hollow out the content, to hollow out the central content. Let me stop there because it's again a big question, but a good one.
Yes, yes, yes. Then again, Sabana is asking about the relevance of modernism for the present day context.
Hmm. Yeah, I think I've sort of variously marked this in the talk, but anyway, let me try and consolidate. One is that, of course, as I said, modernism is contemporary. That's one thing uh, to think about. Let's not make this mistake of locking it in a certain historical period. Modernism is still very much being, staged in the history of literature, because there are many, as I mentioned a few writers as well, if you heard me there, that there are contemporary writers who very much take after a modernist tradition. In fact, what has happened, interestingly, is that that distinction between modernism and postmodernism has largely collapsed in the last 10 years. And many of the writers who were considered postmodernist are now considered back again as a sort of neo-modernist. So it's very interesting how these, of course, critical trends change, but it's relevant in many ways. To sort of give one example, as someone like Jean-Michel Rabate famously says, modernism is our classicism. When we go back to modernism now, because if you contrast the popular trends in literature, if you consider or compare, a Chetan Bhagat novel, for example, right, with a Joyce novel or with a Woolf novel, that contrast is very important because it gives us a sense of classicism in the past. Or even, within the Indian context, if you compare Chetan Bhagat with Anita Desai, she would not be very happy with that comparison, nevertheless. But anyway, if we do that, perhaps she would not be very happy, I'm guessing. But anyway, if we do that comparison, we realize what's going on here. Right? And again, someone like I just mentioned Jerry Pinto, I would strongly recommend everyone to read a novel like the novel like M and the Big Whom, which is absolutely a modernist novel written in 21st century. So again, modernism is not a historically segregated period. It's very much there and relevant as any other literary text is.
So coming back to the questions, this is from Preeti Mondol, who, if I remember, if I'm not mistaken, is a faculty member. Uh, Hi, Preeti, thank you for that question. You have talked about modernism as more about style rather than a historical time period. I just want to know what kind of styles have been applied in the works of Shakti Chattopadhyay and Sandipan Chattopadhyay, comparing to the Western mode of modernist
Okay,
styles.
that's a very specific question. Okay, thank you, Diti. I'll try and respond to that, though it's not very easy, of course, because again, it will take us into a different direction. Uh, because the two writers you mentioned are very different and they predominantly chose one genre over another. Shandipan did write a few poems, but very few, and not very good, as he himself knew. Shakti's novels are, of course, much better than that. If you especially think of the first novel, Kumotala, it's quite a masterpiece. For anyone who hasn't read this novel, unfortunately, there's no English translation, but it should be read. Those of you who read Bangla, please read the novel. It's a wonderful novel. And it's a sort of a counterblast to something like the Opu trilogy. Or sorry, I just mentioned the Satyajit Ray reference. But anyway, you see what I mean. I mean, the character of Nirupam in Kuotala is a sort of a counterblast to Opu. Anyway, to come back to your question, what kind of modernist styles do they use? Shakti Chattopadhyay is a very complex example because Shakti Chattopadhyay is also a pastoralist at some level. If you read Kuotala, what comes out very clearly is a sort of affinity with the Jibanananda Das tradition of novel writing. I would place Kuotala with the likes of, uh, uh, Malloban or Shrutirtho or Jalpaihati, Karubashana, these novels. These are novels by Jivanananda Das that were discovered much later, as we know. And Shandipan famously said this, that, now that I know, Jivanananda wrote all these novels, and funnily enough, without knowing about them, I wrote in that same direction. What are my novels worth if you compare them to Jivanananda's? Anyway, without getting into that, so Shakti is a complex example, but there are cases of pastoralism within modernism. So one of the novels that we will read after the semester break here in IIT Gandhinagar in the experimental modernism course that I offered this semester is, and I keep changing novels every semester or whenever I offer it. This time we are going to read a novel called Lucy Church Amiably by Gertrude Stein. And this is an incredibly complex but pastoral novel. Pastoralism is not something we think about, right? Readily, when we think about modernism, we think about urbanity. But pastoralism is an important trope within modernism as well, in a very subversive way. And, Stein kind of goes at pastoralism, as it were, but it is still pastoralist in a very weird way. So, Shakti is a very complicated example, also because of his own very strong association with a kind of romantic poetry, one could say. Shandipan is much more classically modernist, I would say. Why? Again, so many different things to say, and I've worked more on Shandipan than Shakti, I must say. But nevertheless, to give one example, uh, the sick bed narrative, which is a very famous modernist narrative. If you think of Thomas Mann, or if you think of even Beckett, Malone dies. The sick bed narrative is something that we have in a huge way in someone like Shandipan, partially taking after Manik Bandyopadhyay there. If you think about Jibon Ekhon Onek Shatej Shaste Bhara, or Ekhon Amar Kono Oshuk Nei, which is not so much of a sick bed narrative, but this wonderful, masterful last novel, what is it called? Bhongsher Moddhe Diye Jatra, Journey Through the Ravens. These are novels where the modernist question of style comes in through a very complicated collage. Like the character who is in an asylum in this novel suddenly becomes Van Gogh, and his relationship with his brother suddenly becomes an analog for the relationship that Van Gogh had with his brother Theo, right? So there are very complex ways in which it appeals to that whole modernist idea of narrative collage. Shorge Nirjan Upakule is again a late novel by Shandipan, a novella, and again I would strongly recommend anyone and everyone to read it. It's a novel that cuts up a short story by Shorodindu, Rakto Shandha. In the middle of the novel, we have pages taken out of Shorodindu. So these are the kind of modernist experiments we have in Shandipan. Again, this will become too long an answer, so let me stop.
Okay, thank you, Orkoda. That was a very interesting. I might say probably not in its entirety the question. I mean, it's not possible to answer that question in its entirety, but the pointers that you gave, I think they are going to be very useful. Okay, so Doipayan also happens to be a faculty member.
Yeah, I know.
Hello, Doipayan. Yes. Oh, I forgot. You two are already known to each other. Doipayan asks, how did Einstein's theory of relativity and Heisenberg's uncertainty principle create an impact on the modern novel?
Okay. Again, very interesting questions, pointed but also vast. Okay. Let me direct you to an essay which you might have already read or known about, but it's, to my knowledge, perhaps the only detailed essay on Einstein's relativity and modernist literature. There's a Bloomsbury Companion on modernist literature, and in that, Paul Sheehan has written an essay on relativity. So what he does, what Paul Sheehan does in that essay, is to talk about to what extent writers like D.H. Lawrence, for example, or Virginia Woolf and Joyce definitely would have read the works of Einstein, Relativity, and one way of responding to that question is to talk about time in modernism, right? These ideas of involuntary memory that I should have mentioned, didn't, couldn't, I forgot, I guess. Marcel Proust came up with this idea of involuntary memory in his famous magnum opus, The Remembrance of Things Past, La Roche. And in this idea of involuntary memory, we have a certain relativization of time. So these are memories that are coming back to us without us wanting to remember them, right? So involuntary, that's the idea. So these involuntary memories create these very complicated relativistic warps in time. They warp time in a way, right? So I think one way of understanding that connection is to go back to time. The question of time and the sort of multi-directionality of time, multilinearity of time in modernist literature, and approach that through Einsteinian relativity. Right? And there are some interesting analogs that Sheehan discusses in that essay. I would definitely recommend that. The second question is a little more complicated in a certain sense because there are actually texts of, I'm thinking of a theatrical work here, Michael Frayn. Michael Frayn has written a play, which, if I'm not mistaken, is called Copenhagen. And it's a play on the famous Copenhagen Conference and
Yes,
the
yes.
uncertainty principle that kind of came out of that, as it were, as one of its byproducts. Uncertainty principle, you're right, is a very interesting idea that would definitely resonate with modernism on many accounts, on ontological uncertainty, on uncertainty of meanings, because modernism, of course, believes in this general idea of multiple meanings of a literary text, which is now, quite a general notion in literature, not just in modernist literature. We say that about any quote unquote great work of literary art. Anyway, but I think we could think of Heisenberg's thought as a sort of uh, direct theme in some works, but we could also largely build on this idea of uncertainty, just as the term impossibility in continental philosophy of the 20th century had a very strong implicit and explicit relation with Gödel's theorem. You know, the great example of this is Derrida. If you follow Derrida's references to impossibility, there's always some Gödel at the backdrop. Anyway, so ideas in science have definitely inspired. I wouldn't say the attempt, though. Let me make one point to finish this response. The idea is not to just emulate a scientific idea in modernist literature. What we see and what I personally find most fascinating about these works is that they will take out something which is completely tangential to that scientific tradition as an idea and use it. So it's not that they would use uncertainty precisely in the sort of Heisenbergian sense, but they would take a certain angle from there. And quite often, what we see in literature is that various scientific notions, constructs, they offer a wonderful image. And I'm harping on the word image here, image for literature. Mathematics, quite often, in a very complex graphic form, produces an image that literature gets fascinated by. Right? So, anyway, I mean, we could go on and on, but anyway, let me stop there. Thank you.
Okay, so Orpoda, before I move on with the next questions, there are three more questions. Would you have time for that? I would request you
Maybe
to.
we could take them together and let me try and
Okay, okay,
respond to
yeah,
them
yeah,
as much as
that would
possible.
be that would
Yeah,
be great.
I'm going to make a note as you say them. Yeah,
Yes,
please go
yes.
ahead.
Okay, so Deb Malo is asking about the way Freud and Marx have had an impact on modernism, or whether they have at all had an impact. Sabana has asked about the differences, interconnections between modernism and postmodernism. And I can see Murshedda's question here. Hello, Murshedda.
Thank
Murshedda has asked to you to comment, referring to you the point you made about modernist art being elitist, and Murshedda's question is about how you view modernist art vis-a-vis the common mass. What led some modernist writers to sympathize with fascism?
Okay. Okay, these are all very interesting questions. I think the first one, I've actually talked at some length about it. So I don't know whether you missed that part of it or whatever, you were not there. Whoever asked the question, sorry, I can't remember the name. But anyway, Freud and Marx, because I did talk about that influence, right? But let me just give a very brief answer here. So Marx primarily influences, or Marxism, let's say, influences literature and the very production of literature. If you think of the work of the famous French literary critic, Pierre Macheret, Pierre Macheret talks about the production of literature, literature as an institution, right? Again, a great Marxist literary critic, Peter Berger, writes a book on the avant-garde, where he's, again, trying to politicize modernism through Marxism. So attempts like that have been made by, again, arguing that abstraction itself is a historical process. So when you say modernist art is abstract, it does not mean it's depoliticized. Just again, examples. But of course, there are many themes within modernist works, such as alienation, as I mentioned, or the very theme of capitalism. Capitalism plays an important role when we talk about social representations in modernist literature. Class struggle. These are ideas that are coming from modernism, right? Time in the modern factory sense of clock time. Labor. Labor in Marx is a very complicated notion, contrary to what sometimes the vulgar party line would like to think. Labor is, Marx has this great idea of the abstract labor, which is an ontological notion of labor. How human beings, now this is a slightly humanistic idea in a hierarchical sense, but Marx believed that human beings have to do something always. There has to be a continuous labor, and this is an ontological labor. They're not factory workers. Not all human beings are factory workers, of course, right? But they're all laborers in different ways. This was Marx's vision of the abstract labor or the ontological labor. So labor itself as a theme could be considered. Freud, it's huge. Again, I mean, we could devote a week on that. But, Freudian psychoanalysis brings in the notion of the unconscious, which becomes a very exciting notion for writers like surrealism. They practice automatic writing. They try and go into the unconscious, ironically, in a conscious way. Then you have a sort of a negative reaction to psychoanalysis, where, in the Dadaist Manifesto, if you remember, if you've read that, Tristan Tzara famously says in the Dadaist Manifesto that, psychoanalysis is dangerous because it tries to give a general account of the human mind, which is not true. But at that point, we have to see the context in the 1910s and 20s, when Freudian psychoanalysis has just about sort of reached it to a certain cultural auspices, a certain set of cultural codes are created around psychoanalysis. That's an assumption that many people make, that it's a generalization of, it's a generalized theory of human mind. Interestingly, this resistance to a generalized theory of human mind is something that we see in literature of that period. Again, I go back to a Bangla text. There's a wonderful moment in Malloban where Malloban is having a nocturnal conversation with his wife. And Malloban at one point says, Freud, have you heard the name? So he seems to have a theory of all our minds, a theory about all our minds. How does he know what we think? How does he know what our minds are like? This is a very typical creative writer's reaction to any kind of theorization of the mind, which might take away from the wonder of the creative process. Because the creative process does entail going into your mind a little bit, if not in a very immersive sense, at least in some form or the other, right? So let me stop there with the first question, because it's impossible otherwise to at least approach the other two. The second question, differences between modernism and postmodernism. As I said, modernism is more about time. I'm going by Brian McKell here, not saying much on my own. Whereas postmodernism is more about space. Modernism is ontological fiction. Modernism is epistemological fiction. and postmodernism is ontological fiction. These are the Brand-McCall distinctions. There are similarities, of course. If you read the Cambridge Introduction to Modernism that McCall wrote much later in the 21st century, this book, Postmodernist Fiction, was written in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken. So when he wrote this book, he revised some of his own ideas, and I think he sees more continuities between modernism and postmodernism now than he would have seen earlier, now that postmodernism is also becoming a historical phenomenon. So another difference is perhaps that, and here let me cut into Mushedda's question about elitism, because they're related. Postmodernism believes in this idea of the avant-pop. Like avant-garde in modernism, postmodernism believes in avant-pop, where you mix genres, you mix high art with low art, right? And by mixing high art and low art, you sort of deconstruct or you erase that cultural divide between, high art and low art, right? So that's a postmodernist, technique, the avant-pop. And again, there's a discussion of this in the Brand-McCall book I just mentioned, the Cambridge Introduction to Modernism. Postmodernism. But to come to the last question, Mushedda's question in more detail, it's a complicated question. And how does one think about modernism as an elite form of artistic experiment or artistic innovation? What is its cachet or reception in popular readers, among popular readers? Well, first thing, I think we should acknowledge the fact that the the mass, so to speak, to use that word, the mass, reading something like Finnegan's Wake is quite difficult to absorb, because in all likelihood, they will not read it. Having said that, the other thing to keep in mind is that what we typically call the masses, they perhaps will not even read Chetan Bhagat, right? If we are thinking of the working class, if we are thinking of farmers, if we are thinking of the lower rung of the society. So that's, I think, a broader question than modernism, where, as Manik Bandyopadhyay once famously said, he was, of course, all his life he had to battle with poverty. And at one point, with a certain degree of frustration, he said, in a country like ours where people can't eat, what can you do writing books? What can you do writing novels? So anyway, I mean, without necessarily going into that framework, one could consider whether literature is always an ideological structure that is primarily catering to not necessarily the upper class caste, clientele, but also primarily the middle classes, and not so much perhaps the lower rung. This may not be true only for modernism. It could be true for other kinds of writings as well. Because, of course, I mean, just to, again, go back to that same example, and I'm using Chetan Bhagat as an example because he's a bestseller, he's so widely read in India, and all of that. But the interesting part is, he's only read by people who read English novels. That's the first point to keep in mind, that there's still a large part of Indian readers who will not read an English novel, who will read a novel in their vernacular language, whatever that language might be. So the question of elitism, again, I think we have to go in layers, but it's true that formal experiment can produce a very difficult text sometimes. And there are cases like that in modernism. But sometimes I also feel, unless we are talking about the masses, again, in that sense where, as I said, I don't know to what extent they would read literature. They may not have the time, they may not have the inclination, they may not feel the necessity also, right? And again, I say that with a lot of respect for the people we are talking about. I'm not saying that they can't. I'm saying they don't, or perhaps they will not, unless, of course, they're brought into a certain educational framework, and that's different, right? Then we're talking about a very different kind of a more sociological question, I suppose. But to finally respond to that sub-question you had, Mushedda, which is about why some of these modernist writers were so fascinated by fascism. It's funny that the word fascism and the word fascination, they have the same stem, right? They come from the same root word. So there's something fascinating about fascism, whether we like it or not. I would like to perhaps respond to that question through an example that most of you here might be aware of, which is the great play of the Romanian playwright Eugene Ionesco. And the play is, of course, Rhinoceros. It is widely understood that the disease this play talks about, rhinoceritis, is actually an allegory for fascism, an allegory for Hitler's holy terror. One of the things that Ionesco quite deeply explores in this play, especially through the character of Berenguer, if we think of his last speech, where he's trying to resist, that disease, as it were, where everyone else has turned into a rhinoceros. Uh, this sort of, you know, bizarre trope which is used as an allegory for fascism. What is highlighted in Ionesco? Of course, Ionesco was not a fascist writer by any stretch of the imagination, but I think what is highlighted is precisely that value of fascination that fascism has. And I think a lot of people were attracted by that cult value of fascism, be it the hypermasculinity of figures like, Hitler or Mussolini, or this, energetics of the war. There was a certain fetishization of violence, and there is, looking at the global political culture, again, we've gone back to a certain idea of these strong, quasi dictatorial political leaders all across the world, across right and left, who, and of course, more right than left, because, unlike the 20th century, right wing politics seems to have really taken over in the 21st. But anyway, we have gone back to that leader cult, and it still seems to have a very strong value of fascination. So maybe that's how I would respond to that question. But of course, it's not an answer, it's a response. I mean, I'm sure there will be other reasons for that fascination.
Okay, so I would have loved to see this discussion going on further. It was going towards a very interesting direction, I must say. But time is a major factor, just like I mentioned to the audience. Uh, or to Orkoda, saying a mere thanks is never enough. I mean, the way he keeps mapping complex, extremely nuanced territories. He has done that before for our students, for our department, when he so kindly discussed Samuel Beckett's Endgame earlier this year. And I am just amazed how he managed to inform so much about such a heavily contested term, modernism. I mean, the questions themselves somewhat give an idea about the different notions that people have about modernism, about the different facets it has. And I'm so glad that the discussion never bordered on Eurocentrism, which I found to be a major problem of earlier years of modernist studies. So I thank Orkoda, thank the audience wholeheartedly for joining us. Let's just say that maybe our discussion today has given us many pointers that I myself have got a handful, I must say. I'll be going back to them. And since this lecture is to be published in YouTube, I think it's going to help significantly people interested in learning modernism, in getting an introductory idea about its impact on literature and culture in general. So thank you, Orkoda. Have a very good day,
Thank you so much
and
for having me.
all the
And
best.
thank
All
you
the
for all
best.
the great questions. I mean,
Yes. All the
without the
best for,
questions, you don't feel like
yes,
talking for so long,
yes,
right?
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. Well,
So
thank you so much.
thank you
Okay.
everyone.
Bye bye.
We'll
Bye.
be switching off the recording mode now.